Condemned as the world's most evil man, Aleister Crowley shocked conservative Britain with his openly bisexual tendencies and extreme occultism. However, historical documents reveal a hidden truth. This disgraced provocateur secretly provided his services to British intelligence, using his knowledge of symbolism to help Winston Churchill wage psychological warfare against the Nazis. While historians continue to debate the legitimacy of these wartime espionage claims, many viewing them as Crowley's own self-fabricated myths, his radical subversion of British society remains an undisputed fact. What drives a child raised in extreme religious isolation to architect such a dark, lifelong rebellion? The origin traces back to 1875 in Royal Leamington Spa, Warwickshire. Born Edward Alexander Crowley, he entered a family bound by the Exclusive Brethren, a fundamentalist and highly restrictive faction of the Plymouth Brethren sect. His father, an itinerant preacher backed by a massive brewing fortune, traversed the country to preach total separation from a world he deemed inherently doomed. The household functioned as a psychological cage. Plymouth Brethren doctrine dictated the Bible as the literal, infallible truth and the sole acceptable text for existence. Fiction, poetry, and secular literature were strictly banned. Socializing with children outside the sect was forbidden. The psychological atmosphere hung heavy with the looming threat of the rapture and the physical torments of hell awaiting sinners. Natural childhood curiosity was immediately suppressed as a manifestation of innate depravity. The boy was constantly reminded that he was inherently flawed, watched by a punitive God, and surrounded by a society destined for eternal damnation. The fracture in this architecture of control occurred in 1887. His father, the absolute enforcer of the sect's laws, died of tongue cancer when the boy was 11. In many Orthodox families, losing a patriarch deepens devotion. For Edward Alexander Crowley, it triggered a calculated, lifelong campaign of defiance. Recognizing his father's religion as merely a rigid system of rules, the boy deduced the most effective way to assert his own existence was to systematically violate every single one of them. He began his revolt with absolute precision, targeting the specific anxieties of his mother, Emily Bertha Bishop. He engaged in behaviors guaranteed to provoke horror within the strict confines of their beliefs. He sought out the company of prostitutes. He openly cursed and blasphemed during mandatory prayer sessions. He committed acts of self-defilement while deliberately focusing his mind on religious iconography. This was not the chaotic acting out of a grieving child. It was a methodical desecration of everything his family held sacred. The psychological dynamic between mother and son rapidly devolved into open warfare. Emily Crowley, entirely unequipped to handle a child who actively rejected the foundational reality of her universe, reacted with intense, panicked condemnation. Horrified by his deliberate obscenities and his total lack of repentance, she lashed out during a confrontation, screaming that her son was the beast. This was not a casual insult. In the theology of the Plymouth Brethren, the beast was a direct reference to the apocalyptic monster detailed in the Book of Revelation, the ultimate enemy of God, destined to rise from the sea and bring about the end of days. She intended the label to instill absolute, paralyzing fear. Instead, it provided him with an identity. The boy absorbed the maternal curse and weaponized it. He found the concept thrilling. He began to view himself not as a sinner requiring salvation, but as an active agent of opposition against the restrictive moral framework of Victorian England. He formally adopted the title, eventually signing his correspondence as the Beast 666. He wore the designation as a lifelong badge of honor, cementing his commitment to embodying the exact antithesis of his upbringing. To finalize his vengeance and demonstrate his absolute contempt for the sanctity of the family home, he seduced a maid and consummated the act in his mother's own bed. The transition was complete. Edward Alexander Crowley ceased to exist, replaced by a man who would soon rename himself Aleister, entirely dedicated to the desecration of the established order. In 1895, The British Empire was consumed by a profound moral panic. The playwright Oscar Wilde had just been sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for the crime of gross indecency, a ruling that effectively destroyed his life and sent a shockwave of terror through the British establishment. Paranoia swept through the elite institutions of London and the ancient universities. To be a man who loved men in late Victorian England was to live with a permanent target on your back. It meant facing the constant threat of total social annihilation, blackmail, imprisonment, and complete ruin. This was the exact historical moment that the young Aleister Crowley chose to step out of his repressive Plymouth Brethren childhood and into the wider world. Arriving at Trinity College, Cambridge, heavily armed with his massive family inheritance and an absolute contempt for the society that had executed Wilde's social standing, Crowley saw the strict laws governing human sexuality not as boundaries to be respected, but as battle lines to be crossed. In December 1896, at the age of 21, Crowley traveled to Stockholm, Sweden. It was a freezing, isolated environment, far removed from the suffocating oversight of his British peers and the immediate threat of London police. Here, on New Year's Eve, he underwent an experience that would permanently alter the trajectory of his life and the history of 20th century occultism. Historical records and his own private diaries point to a profound mystical awakening, an event that he explicitly and directly linked to his first fully realized homosexual encounter. In the late 19th century, medical texts, psychiatric institutions, and religious authorities universally classified same-sex attraction as a severe pathology, a mental disease, or an outright abomination before God. Crowley experienced the exact opposite. During this physical encounter in Stockholm, he reported a sudden, overwhelming expansion of consciousness. He theorized that the sheer societal taboo surrounding the act, the absolute transgression against Christian morality, generated a psychological shockwave capable of temporarily fracturing reality. He realized that sexual climax, particularly a climax deemed illegal and damned by the state and the church, was not a sin. It was a mechanism. It was a key to unlocking hidden supernatural energy. By embracing his bisexuality, he was entirely weaponizing his own body against the God of his father. He understood that to engage in homosexual acts was to commit an act of spiritual warfare against the prevailing order. Returning to Cambridge in 1897, Crowley was no longer just a rebellious student with a trust fund. He was a man actively seeking to dismantle moral boundaries. He quickly found his catalyst in a man named Herbert Charles Pollitt. Pollitt was a prominent, highly visible figure within the university's elite circles. He served as the president of the Footlights, the prestigious amateur theatrical club that functioned as a training ground for the upper echelons of the British establishment. But Pollitt lived a complex, dangerous double life. Within the private, heavily guarded walls of elite Cambridge society, he regularly performed as a female impersonator under the stage name Diane de Rougy, a deliberate homage to the infamous French courtesan Liane de Pougy. Pollitt was sophisticated, somewhat older, heavily involved in the decadent art movement, and entirely unapologetic about his subversive lifestyle. Crowley was instantly, overwhelmingly mesmerized. According to historical archives focusing on queer history, including records from the GLBTQ archive, the relationship that developed between Crowley and Pollitt was not a fleeting collegiate romance or a mere experimentation. It was an intense, consuming, and deeply committed partnership. They moved in together, establishing a domestic arrangement that functioned essentially as a marriage within the shadows of the university. Crowley, a man who would later spend his life cultivating a public image of terrifying, unfeeling cruelty, was completely dismantled by Pollitt. He poured out his obsession in letters and poetry, revealing a desperate, agonizing vulnerability. He wanted complete possession of Pollitt, physically, mentally, and spiritually. He envisioned them not just as lovers, but as partners in a grand rebellion against the mundane world. but the relationship was doomed by the very obsession that drove Crowley forward. While Pollitt was a rebel in terms of gender presentation and sexuality, his rebellion was fundamentally aesthetic and social. He was an art collector, a performer, and an entertainer, not a mystic. When Crowley began pushing deeper into the occult, demanding that Pollitt participate in complex, bizarre rituals to contact unseen entities and harness magical energies, Pollitt flatly refused. He viewed Crowley's magical ambitions as absurd, socially dangerous, and deeply disturbing. Pollitt eventually ended the relationship, refusing to follow Crowley into the dark territories he was determined to explore. This rejection shattered Crowley. The dissolution of their domestic life was a psychological catastrophe for the young mystic. It was a foundational heartbreak that permanently warped his approach to intimacy. Never again would Crowley allow himself to be the vulnerable, submissive partner in a relationship. In the decades that followed, his treatment of male lovers would become increasingly sadistic, demanding, and controlling, a direct, brutal overcompensation for the pain and powerlessness he endured when Herbert Pollitt walked away. Yet, the emotional resonance of that time never fully faded. Years later, unable to let go of the memory, Crowley would write and privately circulate The Scented Garden of Abdullah in 1910. It was a profoundly rare, exquisitely crafted collection of Sufi-inspired homosexual love poetry written entirely as an enduring, aching monument to Pollitt. The immediate aftermath of the breakup in 1898 saw Crowley channel his devastation and rage into an unprecedented literary assault on British morality. If he could not live openly with the man he loved, he would force the society that condemned them to look directly at its own hypocrisy. At the age of 22, he wrote White Stains. It was a calculated, extreme assault on Victorian prudery. The collection contained highly explicit, clinical, and unapologetic descriptions of homosexuality, sadomasochism, and taboo sexual practices, heavily intertwined with violent blasphemy against Christian sacraments. Crowley was asserting a terrifying new philosophy to the conservative elite, that the most degraded, socially repulsive sexual acts were, in fact, sacred rites capable of elevating the human soul far above the reach of traditional prayer. Publishing such a text in London, with the memory of the Oscar Wilde trial still fresh in the minds of the police, was an act of extreme legal peril. To avoid immediate arrest and imprisonment, Crowley had to operate in the criminal underground. He sought out Leonard Smithers, the only publisher in London daring enough to print decadent and forbidden literature. To bypass the draconian British censorship laws, the manuscript had to be smuggled out of the country and printed covertly in Amsterdam under the pseudonym George Archibald Bishop. The initial run was strictly limited to 100 copies, intended to be distributed privately among the absolute fringes of the British elite, the underground artists, and the wealthy deviants who could protect him. When the authorities inevitably discovered the text, their reaction was swift, terrified, and furious. The British government viewed White Stains not just as illegal pornography, but as a dangerous ideological contagion threatening the moral fabric of the empire. Police and customs officials launched a targeted operation to hunt down every single volume they could find. The confiscated books were not merely locked away. They were taken to the incinerators and systematically burned by the state, an act of sheer desperation to erase Crowley's words from existence. This aggressive, fiery censorship only validated Crowley's worldview. He had successfully provoked the machinery of the British Empire. He had proven that ink on paper, when combined with the absolute rejection of sexual morality, could generate genuine terror in the hearts of the ruling class. However, the destruction of White Stains also marked a turning point. He realized that literature alone was an insufficient weapon. To truly dismantle the reality of the society he despised, and to harness the cosmic forces he believed he had touched in Stockholm, he needed more than poetry. He needed operational power. He needed a formalized, rigorous system of magic. This realization drove him away from the academic halls of Cambridge and directly toward the secretive, highly guarded ranks of the most powerful and aristocratic occult organization in Europe. In the twilight of the 19th century, London was the undisputed center of a global empire, a city defined by industrial might and a rigid, unyielding social hierarchy. Yet, beneath the gaslit streets and the polished veneer of Victorian respectability, a quiet rebellion was taking place in the drawing rooms of the British elite. This was the era of the occult revival. Aristocrats, prominent authors, and dissatisfied intellectuals were turning their backs on traditional Christianity and the cold certainties of modern science, seeking ultimate truth in ancient, forbidden knowledge. At the absolute apex of this underground movement stood the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It was a highly secretive, deeply aristocratic society dedicated to the study and practice of ceremonial magic, tarot, alchemy, and astrology. Its membership rolls read like a registry of the cultural elite, including the poet William Butler Yeats, the actress Florence Farr, and the author of Dracula, Bram Stoker. In 1898, Aleister Crowley, fresh from the destruction of his taboo poetry and reeling from the loss of his first great love, determined that this was where he belonged. He was introduced to the Golden Dawn by a chemist named George Cecil Jones. For Crowley, the order represented everything he desired: a formalized system of rebellion, a pathway to supernatural power, and a direct assault on the mundane world. He was initiated into the outer order, adopting the magical motto Perdurabo, which translated from Latin to I will endure to the end. Initially, Crowley was a spectacular initiate. His prodigious memory, his terrifyingly intense focus, and his vast, independent wealth allowed him to rapidly master the complex rituals, the Hebrew names of God, and the intricate esoteric correspondences that took other members years to learn. He climbed through the outer grades of the order with unprecedented speed. However, a catastrophic ideological collision was inevitable. The Golden Dawn, despite its engagement with demons, angels, and ancient Egyptian deities, was fundamentally a Victorian institution. The leadership treated magic as a high-minded intellectual pursuit, a gentleman's study of the divine. They adhered strictly to the moral and sexual codes of their era. Crowley, conversely, was a walking desecration of those codes. He did not want to study magic in a parlor. He wanted to live it in the gutter and the bedroom. His lifestyle was an open bleeding wound to the aristocratic sensibilities of the order. Rumors of his rampant bisexuality, his association with prostitutes, and his unapologetic promiscuity horrified the senior members. The primary architect of Crowley's opposition was the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. Yeats was a romantic, a man who viewed magic through the lens of Celtic mythology and poetic purity. He looked at Crowley and saw an absolute thug, a wealthy, arrogant, fundamentally unstable provocateur who treated ancient rituals like a violent game. Yeats famously despised him, recognizing instinctively that Crowley's pursuit of magic was entirely devoid of morality. In 1900, the simmering tension fractured the order completely. Crowley had completed the necessary intellectual requirements to be initiated into the Second Order, the inner sanctum of the Golden Dawn, known as the Adeptus Minor. The London leadership, explicitly citing his extreme moral depravity and his unnatural sexual inclinations, flatly refused to initiate him. For Crowley, who had spent his entire life trying to escape the punitive judgment of his Plymouth Brethren parents, this rejection was an unbearable repetition of his childhood trauma. The British establishment was once again telling him he was unclean. Furious, Crowley bypassed the London leadership and traveled to Paris to meet with Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, the supreme head and primary founder of the Golden Dawn. Mathers was an eccentric, highly autocratic leader who was increasingly facing rebellion from his own London lodge. Seeing an opportunity to use Crowley's wealth and aggression to bring the London members to heel, Mathers agreed to initiate Crowley into the Second Order. When news of this unauthorized initiation reached London, the Golden Dawn fractured completely. The London adepts, led by Yeats, officially expelled Mathers and Crowley. What followed was an event that historians refer to as the Battle of Blythe Road, a moment that perfectly encapsulated the absurdity and the genuine danger of the occult underground. Acting as Mathers' enforcer, Crowley returned to London. Dressed in full Highland regalia, wearing a black mask over his face, and armed with a hunting dagger, Crowley physically assaulted the Golden Dawn's headquarters on Blythe Road. He successfully broke into the temple, intending to seize the magical vault and the society's sacred documents by force. Yeats and the London Committee were forced to summon the police to eject the masked mystic from the premises. The legal and social fallout was absolute. The courts ruled in favor of the London Committee. Crowley was permanently cast out of the premier magical order of his time. The Golden Dawn, crippled by the scandal and the internal schism, slowly began to disintegrate. For Crowley, this expulsion was not a defeat. It was an emancipation. If the elite magicians of Europe refused to accept him, he would build a system of magic that would render them entirely obsolete. He spent the next several years in self-imposed exile, traveling relentlessly across the globe. He climbed mountains in Mexico, hunted big game in India, and studied extreme forms of yoga and meditation in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. It was during these wilderness years that Crowley synthesized his ultimate philosophy. He combined the strict mathematical discipline of Western ceremonial magic with the intense physical and mental control of Eastern mysticism. He crystallized his belief that the ego, the rational, societal self, was the absolute enemy of divine knowledge. To reach the divine, the ego had to be annihilated, and he firmly believed that nothing destroyed the human ego faster or more efficiently than absolute physical exhaustion and taboo sexual climax. He was formulating the foundations of sex magic. But a prophet cannot build a religion without disciples. In 1907, Crowley returned to Cambridge, the site of his first great homosexual romance and his first great heartbreak. He was no longer the vulnerable, obsessed student who had chased Herbert Pollett. He was a hardened, cynical occultist, 32 years old, searching for a vessel. He found one in a brilliant, highly neurotic undergraduate poet named Victor Benjamin Newberg. The contrast between Herbert Pollett and Victor Newberg is the key to understanding Crowley's descent into psychological cruelty. Pollett was socially powerful, fiercely independent, and capable of walking away when Crowley's demands became too extreme. Newberg was the exact opposite. He was desperately insecure, prone to deep depressions, and completely mesmerized by Crowley's dominant personality. Newberg, who was Jewish, also occupied a vulnerable social position in the casually anti-Semitic atmosphere of Edwardian England. Crowley did not just seduce Newberg, he consumed him. The relationship quickly devolved into a formalized sadomasochistic dynamic. Crowley convinced the younger man that ultimate spiritual enlightenment required the total destruction of his personal boundaries. What began as a romantic and magical apprenticeship rapidly mutated into severe, systematic abuse. Crowley had finally secured a partner who would never tell him no. The absolute turning point in Crowley's transition from a rebellious occultist to a dangerous predator occurred in the winter of 1909. Crowley decided to test his evolving theories of magic in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, the Sahara Desert. He dragged Newberg deep into the Algerian wasteland. They walked for days into the endless dunes, carrying minimal supplies, a few magical implements, and notebooks. Crowley's objective was terrifying in its ambition. He intended to use an extremely dangerous system of Elizabethan magic to summon an entity known as Coranzon. In the occult tradition, Coranzon was not a simple demon. It was the dweller in the abyss, the absolute personification of dispersion, chaos, and madness. To confront Coranzon was to risk total psychological disintegration. Crowley, operating with supreme arrogance, believed he could master the entity. However, to anchor the demon in the physical world, he needed a battery. He needed a human vessel to generate the necessary psychic energy. He used Victor Newberg. The rituals performed in the Algerian desert stripped away any remaining illusion that Crowley was a benign spiritual teacher. He instituted a regime of unimaginable physical torture under the guise of magical discipline. He forced the deeply devoted Newburgh to march through the scorching heat while starving. At night, as the desert temperatures plummeted, Crowley forced Newburgh to strip completely naked and sleep on top of sharp, thorny bushes. When Newburgh faltered or expressed pain, Crowley would beat him brutally with stinging nettles until his skin was blistered and bleeding. Crowley framed this horrifying violence as necessary to purify Newburgh's soul, but the reality was a grotesque exercise in absolute power. During the climax of the ritual, Crowley traced a magical circle in the sand and ordered Newburgh to stand inside it, armed only with a knife, while Crowley retreated into a triangle drawn nearby to offer his own body as a vessel for the demon. The historical accounts of what happened next, drawn from their own frantic diaries, describe a scene of sheer psychological terror. Crowley, allegedly possessed by Corazon, began to hallucinate wildly, spewing blasphemies, tearing at his own flesh, and throwing sand into Newburgh's eyes to break the protective circle. Newburgh, terrified, dehydrated, and physically battered, had to fight off the man he loved and worshipped, threatening him with the dagger to force the demon back into the triangle. When the ritual finally concluded, neither man was the same. Crowley emerged from the desert entirely convinced of his own supreme godhood. He believed he had successfully crossed the abyss and conquered the forces of chaos, establishing himself as the prophet of a new age. Newburgh, however, emerged as a broken shell. The intense physical torture, combined with the sheer psychological trauma of the rituals, had permanently fractured his nervous system. Worse still, the desert expedition established a terrifying precedent. Crowley had proven to himself that extreme cruelty, starvation, and fear generated potent magical results. He realized that the human mind, when pushed past the brink of terror and physical agony, became incredibly malleable. He had completely subjugated Victor Newburgh, treating him less like a human being and more like a laboratory animal in a horrific spiritual experiment. And yet, the Algerian desert was only a rehearsal. Returning to Europe, Crowley prepared to escalate his experiments with Newburgh, moving from the physical torture of the Sahara to a descent into chemical and sexual madness that would bring them both to the edge of total destruction. The psychological residue of the Algerian desert followed Aleister Crowley and Victor Newburgh back to Europe. The dynamic between the two men had fundamentally and permanently shifted. The Sahara had stripped away any pretense of a standard romantic or even an orthodox teacher-student relationship. Crowley had successfully established himself as an absolute, tyrannical authority, and Newburgh had been reduced to a deeply traumatized, hyper-compliant vessel. Crowley had learned that extreme physical distress, when combined with absolute terror, cracked the human mind wide open, rendering it highly susceptible to suggestion and hallucination. He was eager to push this terrifying methodology further, moving from the austere deprivation of the desert to the sensory overload of an urban environment. In the early months of 1914, Europe was standing on the precipice of the First World War. The cultural atmosphere was thick with anxiety, political tension, and a frantic, decadent desperation. Crowley chose this highly charged environment, specifically the bohemian underworld of Paris, for his next grand occult experiment. He rented an apartment and prepared for what occult historians now refer to as the Paris working. If the Algerian expedition was a test of physical endurance, the Paris working was designed as a marathon of absolute psychological and sensory destruction. The objective of the Paris working was explicitly magical and deeply transactional. Crowley intended to summon specific planetary deities, primarily Jupiter, the Roman god of wealth and supreme power, and Mercury, the god of communication and intellect. His goal was not spiritual enlightenment in the traditional sense. He wanted divine knowledge, immense personal power, and the financial resources to fund his rapidly expanding magical ambitions. To achieve this, he subjected himself and Newburgh to a grueling, continuous 6-week cycle of ceremonial sex magic. During this period, the apartment became a sealed, terrifying laboratory. The rituals were precise, exhausting, and entirely relentless. Crowley operated on the core belief that male same-sex intercourse was the most potent magical technology available. Because it defied the natural biological imperative of reproduction, Crowley theorized that the immense energy generated during the act had nowhere physical to go, allowing it to be channeled entirely into the supernatural realm to manifest his desires. However, to bypass the rational mind and force a connection with the divine, Crowley introduced massive, paralyzing quantities of narcotics into the rituals. The men consumed an aggressive daily regimen of heavy drugs. They smoked copious amounts of hashish, ingested high-grade opium, and utilized early, highly potent forms of synthetic stimulants to keep their bodies functioning far beyond the limits of natural exhaustion. They purposefully pushed themselves into deep, sustained hallucinatory states, blurring the absolute boundaries between reality, drug-induced psychosis, and alleged demonic contact. Under these conditions, the sexual acts were stripped of any intimacy or affection. They became grueling, mechanical, and violently intense procedures designed to tear holes in the fabric of human consciousness. For Crowley, navigating this chemical and sexual madness was an exercise in supreme ego. He believed his iron will could control the chaotic energies they were unleashing. For Victor Neuberg, the experience was a literal descent into hell. His physical body was rapidly failing under the toxic load of the narcotics and the unrelenting sexual demands. More devastating, however, was the systemic psychological warfare Crowley waged against him. Crowley recognized that Newberg's devotion made him vulnerable, and he exploited that vulnerability with surgical cruelty. To ensure that Newberg's personal identity, his ego, remained completely shattered and unable to resist the magical invocations, Crowley subjected him to constant, vicious humiliation. Taking advantage of the casually anti-Semitic culture of the era, Crowley regularly launched horrific, racially motivated verbal assaults against Newberg's Jewish heritage. He degraded Newberg entirely, reducing a brilliant Cambridge poet to the status of a subhuman tool, a mere battery to be drained for Crowley's personal ascension. The human nervous system is not designed to withstand indefinite trauma. As the Paris working concluded, Newberg's mind finally fractured. The total physical exhaustion, the massive narcotic toxicity, and the relentless sadistic abuse triggered a severe, catastrophic nervous breakdown. Realizing that staying with Crowley meant absolute destruction, Newberg desperately severed the relationship and fled. Crowley did not accept this defection gracefully. Furious at the loss of his most compliant disciple, Crowley allegedly unleashed a torrent of magical curses against him. The psychological grip Crowley held over his followers was so immense that contemporary rumors genuinely circulated in occult circles that Crowley had used dark magic to literally transform Newberg into a camel. While objectively absurd, the persistence of this rumor highlights the sheer terror Crowley inspired. People genuinely believed he possessed the power to strip a man of his humanity entirely. The tragic reality was that Newberg did not need a supernatural curse to be destroyed. He spent the rest of his life as a deeply shattered, highly anxious man, forever scarred by the sadistic nightmare he endured in the name of spiritual enlightenment. The outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914 forced Crowley to leave Europe. He relocated to the United States, spending the war years in New York City. Free from the immediate scrutiny of the British press, Crowley's lifestyle escalated from experimental to deeply chronic. He embedded himself in the bohemian subculture of Greenwich Village, a neighborhood teeming with radical artists, writers, and political anarchists. Here, the strict, disciplined occultist began to fully surrender to the very substances he previously claimed to control. His daily intake of narcotics reached monstrous proportions. Heroin, cocaine, ether, and peyote became standard components of his daily existence. He justified this massive substance abuse by claiming that his body was a living laboratory, a sacred vessel necessary for testing the absolute limits of human perception. In reality, the line between ceremonial magic and crippling addiction was rapidly dissolving. His rituals became increasingly bizarre, heavily influenced by the constant chemical distortion of his mind. This period of intense drug use culminated in 1918 with a series of rituals known as the Amalantra working. Operating from a rented apartment overlooking Central Park, Crowley combined his massive daily drug intake with rigorous sex magic, often utilizing female partners whom he designated as scarlet women. His stated objective was to open a direct physical portal to a multidimensional intelligence. During one specific, heavily drug-fueled trance, Crowley claimed to have successfully made contact with a preternatural entity from outside the known universe. He named this entity Lamb. Following the ritual, Crowley sketched a portrait of Lamb based on his visions. The resulting drawing is one of the most unsettling and historically fascinating artifacts of Crowley's life. He drew a figure with a massive, swollen, bulbous head, completely devoid of hair, featuring tiny, indistinct facial features dominated by enormous, slanted, deeply dark eyes. The drawing is instantly recognizable to anyone living in the modern era. Decades before the famous Roswell incident, long before science fiction cinema popularized the concept, Aleister Crowley had drawn an exact, precise representation of what modern pop culture universally identifies as a gray alien. Crowley himself did not use the term extraterrestrial, referring to Lamb instead as an interdimensional guru or a highly evolved spiritual intelligence. Yet, the eerie prescience of the drawing remains a subject of intense debate among occult historians, raising profound questions about the nature of his drug-induced hallucinations and the archetypal images buried deep within the human subconscious. While Crowley was exploring alternate dimensions in New York, the consequences of his earthly actions were beginning to catch up with him. Slowly, steadily, the horrific details of his European exploits began leaking back to the British public. The letters Victor Newberg had written to friends, the whispered confessions of former Golden Dawn members, and the sheer volume of Crowley's own openly published, heavily profane poetry created a critical mass of outrage. The British establishment, deeply traumatized by the massive, unprecedented slaughter of the First World War, was clinging desperately to traditional moral values to maintain societal cohesion. In this extremely conservative climate, Aleister Crowley represented a supreme existential threat. He was a wealthy British citizen openly advocating for the destruction of Christianity, practicing bizarre sex rituals with men and women, and attempting to summon demonic forces. The British press, recognizing a uniquely terrifying villain, began a systematic campaign of vilification. Newspaper editors competing for readership in the post-war slump seized upon the rumors of blood rituals, sadomasochism, and drug orgies. They stripped away Crowley's complex philosophical justifications and presented him to the public strictly as a monster. The headlines became increasingly hysterical, warning the public of a dark, predatory force operating within their ranks. It was during this period that the moniker, the wickedest man in the world, firmly attached itself to him, transforming Crowley from a fringe occultist into a globally recognized symbol of absolute evil. This public branding was incredibly effective. A profound wave of social ostracization crashed down upon him. Anyone discovered associating with Crowley, purchasing his books, or defending his actions faced immediate professional and social ruin. He became entirely toxic, finding himself completely isolated in London, cut off from elite society, and constantly monitored by a hostile press. Crowley realized he could no longer operate within the confines of British civilization. To fully realize his vision of an unrestricted, magical society, he needed a sanctuary far beyond the reach of British law and public morality. He packed his remaining occult implements, gathered a small group of deeply devoted, heavily traumatized followers, and set his sights on the remote, sun-baked coast of the Mediterranean. He was preparing to build a utopian empire, an empire that would rapidly devolve into one of the most horrifying chapters of the 20th century. In the aftermath of the First World War, Europe was a continent fractured by unprecedented trauma and suffocating beneath the weight of millions of dead. In London, the societal response to this trauma was a severe, panicked retreat into traditional morality. Aleister Crowley, having spent the war years in the United States exploring the absolute extremes of drug-induced interdimensional communication and sex magic, returned to a British public that viewed him not as an eccentric intellectual, but as a literal agent of demonic corruption. The relentless attacks by the tabloids, the complete alienation from the aristocratic occult circles that had once entertained him, and the looming threat of legal intervention forced a critical realization. He could no longer attempt to dismantle British morality from within. He required a blank canvas, a territory entirely insulated from the jurisdiction of Scotland Yard and the moral outrage of the London press. He determined to manifest his core philosophy, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," not as a theoretical occult doctrine, but as a living, breathing, physical community. He was going to build an empire of absolute, unrestricted personal freedom. In the spring of 1920, Crowley directed his attention toward the Mediterranean. He required a location that was geographically isolated, economically ruined enough to be incredibly cheap, and populated by locals whose deeply ingrained superstitions would keep them at a terrified distance. He found his dark utopia in Cefalù, a quiet, sun-baked fishing village on the northern coast of Sicily. At the time, Sicily was a neglected, impoverished region of a politically unstable Italy. The modern world had barely touched it. Along with his new primary mistress and designated Scarlet Woman, a Swiss-American schoolteacher named Leah Herzig, Crowley rented a dilapidated, single-story stone farmhouse nestled on a hillside overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. The locals knew it as the Villa Santa Barbara. Crowley immediately rechristened it the Abbey of Thelema. The name was not accidental. It was a direct theft from the French Renaissance writer François Rabelais, who had imagined a fictional anti-monastery where the only rule was that the inhabitants could do whatever they pleased. Crowley intended to bring this satirical concept into terrifying, tangible reality. The stated goal of the abbey was to serve as a revolutionary collegium ad spiritum sanctum, a college of the Holy Spirit. It was pitched to potential followers across Europe and America as a spiritual laboratory where individuals could strip away the toxic, restrictive conditioning of modern civilization, discover their true divine will, and operate as liberated gods on earth. However, the chasm between Crowley's grand, utopian rhetoric and the physical reality of the Abbey of Thelema was immediate and absolute. The farmhouse was severely primitive. It lacked running water, indoor plumbing, and basic sanitation. In a functioning commune, the first order of business would be to establish latrines, secure a clean water supply, and initiate a strict regimen of hygiene to prevent disease in the sweltering Mediterranean heat. Crowley, however, operated on the absolute, narcissistic conviction that mundane physical labor was beneath the dignity of a supreme magical adept. He demanded that his followers dedicate every waking hour to complex ceremonial rituals, exhaustive diary keeping, and prolonged sexual experiments. The inevitable result was rapid, catastrophic physical decay. Within months, the Abbey of Thelema devolved into a squalid, unsanitary nightmare. Garbage piled up in the courtyard. Human excrement was casually disposed of in the surrounding bushes. The property was overrun by feral dogs and cats, which the inhabitants allowed to roam freely through the living quarters, often sleeping on the same unwashed mattresses where the communal sex rituals took place. Dysentery, severe skin infections, and constant fever became standard conditions of life for the disciples. Yet, Crowley enforced a strict ideological blindness to this filth. He demanded that his followers view the squalor as a necessary test, a deliberate breaking down of their bourgeois attachments to comfort and cleanliness. To complain about the smell of rotting food or the presence of parasites was to admit that your ego was still tethered to the mundane world. The psychological architecture of the Abbey was far more dangerous than its physical deterioration. Crowley established an environment of total, suffocating, authoritarian control disguised as ultimate spiritual liberation. At the absolute center of this psychological warfare was a specific chamber within the farmhouse that Crowley named La Chambre des Cauchemars, the nightmare room. Crowley took it upon himself to personally decorate the walls, floor, and ceiling of this room. Drawing heavily on his massive, ongoing intake of mescaline, cocaine, and hashish, he painted sprawling, aggressive, highly explicit frescoes. The artwork was deliberately designed to assault the senses and shatter the psychological defenses of anyone who entered. The walls were covered in chaotic, swirling depictions of violent sodomy, bestiality, demonic entities, goblins, and grotesque parodies of Christian saints. It was a localized, concentrated manifestation of hell, rendered in vibrant, toxic colors. The Nightmare Room was not simply an art project. It was Crowley's primary tool for psychological subjugation. He mandated a terrifying practice for all initiates, including the young children who had been brought to the Abbey by their devoted parents. Followers were heavily dosed with high-grade psychedelics, or massive quantities of concentrated hashish. Once the drugs stripped away their rational defenses, they were forced into the Nightmare Room, the door locked behind them. They were ordered to spend hours, sometimes entire nights, staring directly into the terrifying frescoes. Crowley's stated philosophical justification was that in order to conquer fear, a magician had to face the absolute darkest, most repulsive elements of the human subconscious without looking away. If a follower suffered a panic attack or a psychotic break while trapped in the room, it was framed as a spiritual failure, a sign that their ego was fighting against divine enlightenment. In reality, it was a highly effective method of brainwashing. By forcing his disciples to endure chemically induced terror while isolated in a visually traumatic environment, Crowley systematically broke down their independent psychological structures, rendering them entirely dependent on his approval and interpretation of reality. The war on the individual ego extended into every single interaction within the Abbey. Crowley was obsessed with the idea that the concept of the self was the primary obstacle to magical power. To enforce the total annihilation of personal identity, he instituted one of the most brutal and universally applied laws of the commune, the absolute ban on the word I. The disciples were instructed to replace the singular pronoun with we or one. To ensure compliance, Crowley mandated a system of immediate physical self-mutilation. Every member of the Abbey was required to carry a sharpened razor blade at all times. If a follower accidentally slipped in conversation and used the word I, they were legally required by the rules of the Abbey to immediately draw the razor and slice a deep cut into their own flesh, typically on the forearm or the chest. This was not a symbolic scratch. It was designed to draw significant amounts of blood and inflict sharp, memorable pain. Over time, the arms and chests of the disciples became cross-hatched with dozens of jagged, infected scars. This practice served a dual purpose. It kept the followers in a constant state of hypervigilance and physical anxiety, preventing them from ever relaxing into their own natural thought patterns. More insidiously, it physically branded them. It transformed their own bodies into living, bleeding testaments to Crowley's absolute authority. They were punishing themselves on his behalf, internalizing the violence so deeply that Crowley rarely had to lift a finger to enforce discipline. The disciples policed and mutilated themselves. The spiritual core of the Abbey's daily life was a blasphemous, highly ritualized inversion of Orthodox religion, primarily manifested in Crowley's Gnostic Mass. In direct, calculated mockery of the Roman Catholic sacrament of the Eucharist, Crowley designed a ritual that elevated taboo sexuality to the status of divine communion. The altar within the main temple room was frequently the focal point for public, ceremonial sexual intercourse. Crowley, acting as the supreme priest, and Leah Herzig, acting as the high priestess, would perform explicit sexual acts in front of the assembled congregation, heavily incorporating the use of daggers, chalices, and chanting. The children living in the commune were not shielded from these rituals. They were actively encouraged to observe, as Crowley believed that exposing them to explicit sexuality early would rid them of societal shame. The absolute desecration of Christian norms culminated in the creation and consumption of the cakes of light. In a Catholic Mass, the wafer is believed to transubstantiate into the literal body of Christ. Crowley sought to create a physical communion wafer that contained what he believed was the actual tangible life force of the universe. The recipe for the cakes of light was a closely guarded secret of the cult. The base consisted of meal, honey, and olive oil. However, the crucial magical ingredient was a mixture of fresh blood and human bodily fluids. The blood was often sourced from the followers themselves through their daily self-mutilation, or from the frequent, brutal sacrifices of stray goats and cats that Crowley performed in the courtyard. This blood was mixed with the semen and vaginal fluids, collected immediately following the ceremonial sex acts. The mixture was baked into small wafers and forcibly administered to the disciples. By compelling his highly educated, formerly aristocratic British followers to publicly consume a baked mixture of animal blood and human sexual fluids, Crowley shattered the final, deepest psychological barriers of human disgust. Once a person had eaten the cakes of light, they were bound to the cult by an overwhelming, unspeakable shared trauma. There was no going back to polite society. Despite the horrific realities of disease, psychological torture, and forced drug use, the Abbey of Thelema managed to project a glamorous, dark mystique that continued to attract disaffected intellectuals from across Europe. Crowley was a prolific writer, constantly sending out manifestos and letters portraying the Abbey as the vanguard of human evolution. In 1922, this dark gravity pulled in a young man who would become the catalyst for the cult's ultimate destruction. His name was Raoul Loveday. He was 21 years old, a recent graduate of St. John's College, Oxford. Loveday was widely recognized by his professors and peers as a genius, a brilliant poet, and a first-class historian. However, like many highly intelligent young men of his generation, his academic brilliance masked a profound emotional fragility and a desperate search for meaning in a post-war world that seemed entirely hollow. Loveday read Crowley's writings while at Oxford and became instantly, dangerously mesmerized. He abandoned his promising academic career, packed his bags, and declared his intention to travel to Sicily to study at the feet of the master. Loveday did not go to Sicily alone. He brought his new wife, Betty May. The inclusion of Betty May was a variable Crowley had not anticipated, and she represented the exact antithesis of the ideal cult member. Betty May was not a sheltered aristocrat or a fragile intellectual. She was a fiercely pragmatic, deeply cynical survivor of the London bohemian underworld. She had clawed her way up from profound poverty, working as a singer, a dancer, and a prominent artist's model in the cafes of Soho. She had seen every con artist, grifter, and predator the city had to offer. When she arrived at the Villa Santa Barbara, she was not blinded by Crowley's mystical rhetoric. She looked around and saw a filthy, rotting farmhouse filled with starving, heavily drugged people, entirely controlled by a narcissistic, aging drug addict. The dynamic inside the Abbey immediately fractured into a high-stakes psychological war for the soul and the life of Raoul Loveday. Crowley recognized that Raoul was the perfect disciple, brilliant, compliant, deeply wealthy, and eager to submit. He also recognized that Betty May was an absolute threat to the integrity of the cult. Crowley launched a campaign to isolate Raoul from his wife, telling the young man that Betty's pragmatic, mundane worldview was a heavy anchor dragging him away from true spiritual ascension. Raoul, eager to prove his devotion to Crowley, threw himself entirely into the brutal regimen of the abbey. He willingly participated in the nightmare room sessions. He took up the razor blade and began mutilating his own arms whenever he spoke the word "I." He consumed the heavy narcotics Crowley prescribed to open his third eye. The physical toll on the young, previously healthy Oxford scholar was devastatingly rapid. Under the scorching Sicilian sun, drinking from the contaminated water supply, and weakened by the constant fasting and drug use, Raoul's immune system began to collapse. Betty May fought frantically to break Crowley's spell. She refused to participate in the rituals, actively mocked Crowley's self-proclaimed godhood to his face, and begged her husband to leave the squalor and return to London. But the psychological conditioning of the cult was too deep. Raoul viewed his physical deterioration not as a sign of illness, but as a magical purification. He believed the agonizing stomach cramps and the raging fevers were simply the weakness of his ego leaving his body. Crowley, observing the young man's rapid decline, offered no medical assistance. Instead, he saw an opportunity to push Raoul into the ultimate test of occult devotion, planning a ritual of high blood magic that would sever Raoul from the mundane world forever. Entirely indifferent to the fact that it was pushing the boy directly toward his grave, the absolute climax of the psychological war inside the Villa Santa Barbara occurred in February 1923. Aleister Crowley determined that Raoul Loveday was ready for a supreme initiation, a ritual designed to permanently sever the young Oxford scholar's ties to his former life and bind him irrevocably to the Abbey of Thelema. This initiation centered on an act of explicit blood magic. The ritual demanded a living sacrifice. Crowley selected a cat that wandered the grounds of the commune. Inside the main temple room, heavy with the smoke of incense and hashish, Crowley performed a highly theatrical, brutal execution of the animal. The specific mechanics of the ritual required the immediate consumption of the life force. Crowley ordered Raoul Loveday to step forward and drink a cup containing the freshly drawn blood of the sacrificed animal. Loveday, deeply conditioned by months of psychological abuse, extreme fasting, and the constant threat of the nightmare room, complied. He drank the raw blood. This single act of obedience sealed his fate. The Abbey of Thelema was already a severe biological hazard. The disciples routinely drank from a local mountain spring that was heavily contaminated. Their immune systems were entirely compromised by severe malnutrition and chronic daily ingestion of heavy narcotics. For a physical body already severely compromised by malnutrition and the Abbey's contaminated local spring water, this ritual proved catastrophic. Loveday contracted acute enteric fever, a severe bacterial infection characterized by dysentery, violently high temperatures, and severe intestinal hemorrhaging. Betty May watched her husband begin to die in the sweltering, filthy farmhouse. She desperately demanded that Crowley summon a local doctor from the village. Crowley flatly refused, operating under his doctrine of absolute magical supremacy. Crowley viewed the severe physical illness not as a medical emergency, but as a spiritual trial. He informed Betty May and the other disciples that the fever was simply the young man's ego burning away, a necessary physical purge before he could achieve true divine ascension. He forbade any conventional medical intervention and ordered the disciples to continue their rituals, effectively leaving the 21-year-old scholar to writhe in agony on a soiled mattress. The death of Raoul Loveday was neither magical nor elevated. It was a slow, agonizing, and entirely undignified process of dehydration and systemic organ failure. On February 16, 1923, Loveday died. Historical accounts note that when the young man finally succumbed, Crowley displayed an absolute, chilling indifference. He ordered the body quickly buried in the local village cemetery, treating the death of his most devoted disciple as a minor administrative inconvenience. Betty May did not succumb to the psychological conditioning of the cult, nor did she collapse into silent grief. She weaponized her devastation. She immediately fled the abbey, making her way to the British consulate in Palermo. She demanded financial assistance to return to London, carrying with her the exact details of everything that had transpired inside the commune. Upon arriving in England, Betty May bypassed the authorities and went directly to the tabloids. She understood the British press and knew precisely how to frame the narrative to inflict maximum damage. She sold her story to the Sunday Express and the highly sensationalist publication John Bull. The resulting media explosion was unprecedented in its ferocity. The British press, already deeply suspicious of Crowley, unleashed a serialized forensic exposure of the Abbey of Thelema. The headlines were monolithic and terrifying. They detailed the drug use, the nightmare room, the forced self-mutilation, and the agonizing death of a brilliant young Oxford graduate forced to drink the blood of a sacrificed cat. They painted a picture of an aristocratic British citizen running an island death cult, preying on the weak and the wealthy. It was during this specific media frenzy that the publication John Bull printed a front-page editorial demanding state intervention, famously branding Crowley, "a man we'd like to hang." The scandal quickly outgrew the borders of the British Empire. The intense media scrutiny generated diplomatic shockwaves that reached the capital of Italy. The timing could not have been worse for Crowley's utopian experiment. In Rome, Benito Mussolini had recently seized absolute control of the government, establishing a fiercely nationalist fascist regime. Mussolini was obsessed with projecting an image of Italian strength, rigid order, and strict Catholic morality to the international community. The discovery that a notorious British occultist was running a filthy, drug-fueled sex commune on Italian soil was a direct, humiliating affront to the fascist aesthetic. The regime viewed Crowley not as a powerful magician, but as a degenerate foreigner corrupting the moral hygiene of the nation. The fascist response was swift and uncompromising. Mussolini issued a direct executive order. In April 1923, armed Italian police officers raided the Villa Santa Barbara. They did not engage in theological debate or respect Crowley's claims of divine authority. They handed him a formal deportation order and informed him that he had a matter of days to vacate the country. The property was seized, the remaining followers were scattered, and the Abbey of Thelema was permanently shut down. Crowley's departure from Sicily was an absolute humiliation. He was forced to pack his few remaining belongings and leave the island under heavy police escort. The local villagers, who had long viewed the commune with deep, superstitious terror, openly jeered and cursed him as he walked to the docks. The empire of absolute freedom he had spent years trying to build had collapsed completely, dismantled by a fascist dictator and a grieving widow. The expulsion from Italy marked the beginning of a long, dark period of forced nomadism. Throughout the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Crowley moved erratically across Europe and North Africa. He traveled to Tunis, then to Paris, and eventually to Germany. His vast family inheritance was entirely gone, squandered on self-publishing his massive occult texts, funding his extravagant drug habits, and maintaining the abbey. He was reduced to relying on the charity of a dwindling number of followers and the occasional financial support of wealthy, curious benefactors who sought him out for magical instruction. During these years, the nature of his drug addiction shifted from experimental to deeply chronic. The heroin, originally prescribed years earlier to manage a severe, lifelong battle with asthma, became his absolute master. He required massive, daily injections simply to function and stave off crippling physical withdrawal. The heavy, prolonged use of heroin, cocaine, and ether rapidly accelerated his physical decay. The man who had once climbed the Himalayas and trekked across the Sahara became frail, severely asthmatic, and prone to intense bouts of paranoia. The heavy snorting of cocaine entirely destroyed his nasal septum, leaving his face partially collapsed and requiring multiple painful surgical interventions. Yet, despite his physical deterioration and his status as a global pariah, Crowley's mind remained sharply, dangerously active. As the 1930s progressed, he closely observed the shifting geopolitical landscape of Europe. From his temporary residences in Germany and France, he watched the rapid, terrifying rise of the Nazi Party. While the rest of the world viewed Adolf Hitler as a radical political figure, Crowley recognized something entirely different. He looked at the massive rallies in Nuremberg, the hypnotic speeches, and the rigid, absolute devotion of the German populace, and he identified the mechanics of a massive state-sponsored occult ritual. Crowley understood the deep, esoteric roots of the Nazi movement. He was fully aware of the Thule Society and the other right-wing German occult groups that had deeply influenced the early ideology of the Nazi high command. He recognized that figures like Heinrich Himmler were actively incorporating pagan mysticism and ritualistic structures into the SS. Most importantly, Crowley analyzed Hitler's deployment of the swastika. He knew that the swastika was not a political invention. It was an ancient, highly potent symbol of solar energy movement and aggressive creation. Crowley theorized that Hitler was successfully wielding this symbol on a massive national scale to generate a hypnotic psychological momentum that paralyzed his enemies and radicalized his followers. Crowley firmly believed that the impending war would not just be fought with artillery and aircraft. It would be a war of mass psychology, a battle of competing magical currents. When the Second World War officially erupted in 1939, Crowley found himself back in England. He was a 64-year-old, heavily addicted, socially ostracized bankrupt. The British establishment considered him an embarrassing relic of a decadent era, entirely useless to the war effort. However, as the German military machine tore across Europe, bringing France to its knees and pushing Britain to the absolute brink of annihilation, the desperation within the highest levels of the British government reached a critical mass. Within the shadowy corridors of British intelligence, a small group of highly pragmatic officers began to realize that conventional warfare was failing to stop the psychological terror generated by the Nazi regime. They recognized that the German high command was operating on a deeply irrational, highly superstitious belief system. To counter a profoundly irrational enemy, some officers argued, Britain needed to understand the architecture of that irrationality. They needed an expert in the mechanics of belief, symbolism, and psychological manipulation. They needed a man who understood the dark, occult forces that the Nazis believed they were harnessing. Quietly, unofficially, and completely hidden from the public eye, lines of communication were opened. The man the British press had spent decades trying to destroy was suddenly brought into the absolute fringes of the intelligence apparatus. The intelligence officers, including a young naval commander named Ian Fleming, began to carefully extract Crowley's insights regarding the psychological warfare tactics of the Third Reich. The outcast had found his final, most significant stage. The desperation that gripped London in the summer of 1940 is difficult to overstate. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped absolute annihilation at Dunkirk. France had capitulated in a matter of weeks. The Luftwaffe was systematically pulverizing the capital night after night, reducing ancient architecture in civilian neighborhoods to smoking rubble. The threat of a full-scale Nazi invasion across the English Channel was not a theoretical anxiety. It was considered an imminent, terrifying reality. In this atmosphere of supreme existential crisis, the traditional rules of engagement entirely evaporated. The British military and intelligence apparatus, facing a highly mechanized and seemingly invincible enemy, became willing to weaponize anything and anyone that could provide a psychological edge. The intersection of Aleister Crowley and British intelligence occurred through a network of deeply eccentric, highly pragmatic men operating in the shadows of the war effort. The most crucial connection was Maxwell Knight. Knight was a legendary spymaster for MI5, operating a highly autonomous network of agents under the designation M, a detail that would later be immortalized in fiction. Knight was a brilliant, deeply unorthodox intelligence officer who possessed a profound personal interest in the occult, fringe religious groups, and psychological manipulation. He understood that to effectively infiltrate and dismantle extremist organizations, one had to understand their internal mythology. Knight and his colleagues in the Naval Intelligence Division, which included the young commander Ian Fleming, were acutely aware of a massive vulnerability within the Nazi high command. While Adolf Hitler projected an image of cold, mechanized, Aryan rationality to the world, the internal reality of the Third Reich was heavily dictated by esoteric mysticism. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS, ran his elite guard like a pagan cult, conducting ceremonies at Wewelsburg Castle. The deputy Führer, Rudolf Hess, surrounded himself with astrologers, pendulum dowsers, and occult advisors. The British intelligence apparatus recognized that if the Nazi leadership was making strategic military decisions based on astrological charts and mystical signs, then Britain needed an expert capable of reading that exact same esoteric language. Aleister Crowley, living in London and heavily reliant on a government-mandated heroin prescription, recognized this opportunity immediately. He did not approach the war effort with patriotism. He approached it as a supreme magical conflict. He viewed Hitler not simply as a fascist dictator, but as a rival magician, a dangerous amateur who had accidentally tapped into massive, destructive cosmic currents without the necessary discipline to control them. The most significant and highly debated contribution Crowley allegedly made to the British war effort was the V for Victory campaign. The traditional historical narrative credits the Belgian politician Victor de Lavallee with proposing the V as a unifying radio symbol for resistance movements across occupied Europe, representing Victoire in French and Vrijheid in Flemish. However, the subsequent adoption of the symbol by Winston Churchill and the specific hand gesture, the index and middle fingers raised and separated, possesses a complex, deeply documented occult backstory. Crowley claimed, and subsequent intelligence historians have found corroborating correspondence to suggest, that he provided the psychological and magical justification for deploying the V sign. His analysis of the Nazi propaganda machine focused intensely on the swastika. In occult geometry, the swastika is a dynamic symbol. It represents the sun, continuous forward motion, and an unstoppable, grinding wheel of creation and conquest. Hitler had weaponized this ancient symbol to generate a hypnotic, mass psychological momentum that was paralyzing Europe. Crowley argued to his intelligence contacts that a dynamic symbol could not be defeated by conventional military logic. It had to be neutralized by an opposing, equally powerful magical symbol. He proposed the V sign. In Crowley's complex system of magic, derived from Egyptian mythology and the Hermetic Kabbalah, the V shape represented the horns of Apophis, the ancient Egyptian serpent of chaos, and the destructive force of Typhon. The strategy Crowley outlined was one of targeted psychological sabotage. The V sign was not a symbol of peace. It was a symbol of absolute, terrifying destruction. It represented the open jaws of a crocodile, a wedge designed specifically to be driven into the spinning wheel of the swastika to shatter its momentum. Churchill heavily promoted this gesture, plastering it across newspapers. The BBC broadcast its Morse code equivalent, 3 dots and a dash, perfectly matching the opening notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. In Crowley's mind, the British were unknowingly executing a massive, continent-wide magical ritual. They were weaponizing a symbol of chaos to break the psychological spell of the Third Reich. While bureaucratic historians often dismiss Crowley's involvement as the grandiose boasting of a drug addict, the operational reality of British intelligence at the time tells a different story. They were actively utilizing astrologers like Louis de Wohl to predict Hitler's movements and feed fake horoscopes to the German high command. In this environment, consulting the most notorious occultist in Europe for psychological warfare tactics was entirely consistent with their operational methods. This strange alliance reached its absolute peak in May 1941, during one of the most bizarre and inexplicable events of the Second World War. On the night of May 10, Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer of Nazi Germany and one of Hitler's closest confidants, secretly commandeered a Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighter plane and flew alone across the North Sea. He navigated through the heavily defended British airspace and parachuted into a field in Scotland. His stated goal was to personally negotiate a peace treaty with the British aristocracy to prevent a two-front war before the impending Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. The British establishment was entirely baffled. Why would the second most powerful man in Germany risk his life on a seemingly suicidal, entirely unauthorized diplomatic mission? Intelligence officers rapidly deduced the primary catalyst. Hess had undertaken the flight based on the profound advice of his personal astrologers. He believed the planetary alignments dictated that a specific British duke would be receptive to his peace offering on that exact night. Hess was immediately captured, imprisoned, and subjected to intensive interrogation by MI5 and the Secret Intelligence Service. However, traditional military interrogators found themselves entirely stonewalled. Hess operated in a state of deep paranoia, shifting between profound ideological fanaticism and severe hypochondria. He refused to break under standard questioning. It was at this precise moment that Ian Fleming, operating within the Naval Intelligence Division, drafted a now famous internal memorandum. Fleming understood that a man driven by astrology and mysticism could not be broken by conventional military logic. He proposed a highly unorthodox psychological operation. Fleming formally suggested bringing Aleister Crowley into the interrogation of Rudolf Hess. The logic was flawless. Crowley possessed a massive encyclopedic knowledge of the exact German occult societies that had shaped Hess's worldview. He spoke fluent German. Furthermore, Crowley's absolute mastery of psychological domination and his ability to project an aura of supreme, terrifying authority made him the perfect instrument to crack Hess's fractured mind. Crowley was deeply enthusiastic about the operation. He formally wrote to the Director of Naval Intelligence, Admiral John Godfrey, offering his services. He explained that he possessed the specific magical and psychological vocabulary necessary to bypass Hess's defenses. He requested an immediate interview with the captive deputy Führer, confident he could extract critical intelligence regarding the internal schisms within the Nazi high command. The operation ultimately did not proceed. The highest echelons of the British government, including Winston Churchill, intervened. The political risk was deemed entirely too severe. If the global press discovered that the British government was utilizing the wickedest man in the world to interrogate a senior Nazi official, the resulting scandal would severely damage the credibility of the Allied war effort. The operation was scrapped, and Hess spent the remainder of his life in absolute isolation in Spandau prison. Yet, the fact that the creator of James Bond officially recommended deploying Aleister Crowley as a psychological weapon against the Third Reich stands as a profound historical testament. It validates that beneath the tabloid hysteria and the public revulsion, the most cynical and pragmatic minds in the British government recognized that Crowley possessed a terrifying, highly effective genius for manipulating the human mind. Throughout the Blitz, Crowley remained in London. His behavior during the heaviest bombings was a study in absolute, drug-fueled detachment. While millions of Londoners huddled in terrified darkness inside subterranean bomb shelters, listening to the roar of the Luftwaffe and the shattering explosions above, Crowley routinely refused to take cover. Heavily intoxicated on his government-supplied heroin and large quantities of rum, he frequently climbed to the roof of his apartment building, standing exposed in the night air, surrounded by the blinding beams of anti-aircraft searchlights and the massive rolling fires consuming the city. Crowley performed elaborate magical rituals. He chanted ancient Egyptian invocations into the screaming sirens. He viewed the destruction not as a national tragedy, but as a necessary cosmic purge. According to his deeply entrenched philosophical system, the world was violently transitioning from the Aeon of Osiris, an era characterized by death, sacrifice, and restrictive patriarchal religions like Christianity, into the Aeon of Horus, an era of force, fire, and the absolute liberation of the individual will. For Crowley, the bombs falling on London were simply the violent birth pangs of the new magical age he had prophesied his entire life. By 1945, the intelligence apparatus had completely discarded him. The sprawling estates and international disciples were gone. Reduced to a frail figure in a Hastings boarding house, the man who once preached unrestricted freedom was now entirely enslaved to a heroin prescription. On December 1, 1947, Crowley died quietly from a respiratory infection. Yet he engineered one final spectacle. Per his strict instructions, mourners at his Brighton cremation aggressively recited his pagan poetry. The act completely horrified local authorities, allowing Crowley to successfully cement his status as the ultimate adversary of conservative British morality to the very end.